what happens a lot of times is we get comfortable at a certain point of life, and then we don't want anything about that to change. The problem is it's going to. And it's really simple, because if you start with the wrong perspective, you'll make the wrong choice. I'm not out to hurt anyone's feelings, but between politically correct or correct, I'll choose the last. Hello and welcome to the Chris F. Walker podcast. This is episode 5, and if you're joining me today, I want to thank you for spending some time with me, because we're going to be talking about probably one of my favorite topics today, and it's almost the backbone of a lot of the work that I do. You see, because today we're going to be discussing change. And ultimately, if you've listened to some of the other podcasts that we've done up to this point, we've kind of expressed how I like to express viewpoints in different ways to help kind of, make the point sink in without it possibly being a personal attack. I don't want to personally attack anyone. That's never been my goal. But I do want to try and make sure that people can understand a lot of good perspectives that have certainly proven to be very effective in my own life, as well as lessons that have been learned from mentors throughout the years. And you see, why do we need these perspectives? Why do we need these kind of practical application tools? Is actually very simple. You see, change is inevitable. Change is something that occurs in our life, and we cannot avoid it. But what we can do is we can start trying to affect it. We can start trying to control certain aspects of it. Now, we won't always be able to control everything. That's obviously naive. But what we can do is we can control our own selves, we can control our own actions, and we can start trying to make decisions that will give us every possible chance at having a better outcome as change occurs. You know, and I use an analogy in this. I would invite you, go to the chrisfwalker.com blog. There's a whole series I actually wrote on this some time back. And there's 5 different blogs, all back to back, that all address this topic that we're discussing today. So, link over there, subscribe to that newsletter, make sure that you're getting up on all the changes that occur in my life, as well as the changes that we can start using together to a change and cause good effect in your own life. But I want to really dive into change itself today, because really going into the concept of change truly helps to understand how important it is that we stop sitting on the sidelines. See, a lot of times we kind of just react to things that the world does to us, and we're always frustrated by that. And it's very difficult to take the initiative and actually try and change things in our life for the better in the way that we want them. But it's naive to think that we can't, or even more so that we shouldn't, because change will occur. Here's an example. Let's say that you're opening up your mail and you actually get a letter that says, "Congratulations, no strings attached, you've just won $100,000 and it's completely free and clear. It's just money in the account, welcome to it, there you go." That is a change that would occur in our lives, because $100,000 is certainly going to make an impact. But you see, that's a change that we don't fear. We actually welcome and even long for that kind of change. The problem is that we often only just kind of wish for it. We never pursue it. Now, I'm not telling you to pursue, winning $100,000, because that would kind of lead to maybe a gambling concept, and there's probably some issues there. But what I am getting into is that there's ways you can actually generate revenue. We can create change in that direction. But on that same note, let's say we go to that mailbox again and we check the mail, and this time what we have is a bill, and it's for $100,000. That's another change that just occurred in our life, and we have to react to it. You see, change can be good or bad if it's just sitting here waiting for it to affect us. But if we can start generating positive changes in our life, we can start being prepared for when negative ones occur, and we can even maximize the effect of the ones that we've generated to create a positive outcome for not just ourselves, but our entire family. So the real key to this is understanding change itself. You see, change is inevitable. If you really think about it, if we didn't change, we would never grow. As soon as you're born, you wouldn't change. You'd be exactly the way you were. And of course, that's not how it works. Life is change, because life is growth. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And as we go through the timeline that is our lives, change is always occurring. And in fact, what happens a lot of times is we get comfortable at a certain point of life, and then we don't want anything about that to change. The problem is it's going to. It always will. You cannot avoid change. You see, the day change stops is the day there's no life left in your life. There's only one way things are going to remain the same forever, and that's when you've taken your last breath. Up until then, everything is always going to be an element of change. So as we look at change, I've often tried to explain that one of the most important things we should do is we should embrace the changes that are going to happen, good and bad, because one way or another, they're going to show up. So trying to deny them is actually just going to cause more hardship. You see, change is something that ultimately affects all of us in such a way that we simply cannot avoid the impacts it has, not just on our lives directly, but on how we then turn around and respond to future changes. If you really think about it, how did we learn that fire is hot? We made a mistake and something changed, and in that case, it was painful. It was a painful change. But we then turned around and we learned that that's a change that we try to avoid. If I avoid that fire, that kind of change won't happen again. So we can certainly learn from our mistakes. Now, likewise, if we have a positive change, we tend to often just think of it as we're awesome. You know, it's like, hey, I did this and it worked. Go me. But there's a problem with that. If we don't know why it worked, we can't reproduce it. And as much as we want to say that, hey, maybe we got lucky, the reality is it wasn't a matter of luck. It was a matter of convenient timing of this, that, and the other occurring all in the right circumstances to create the effect that was caused. What we have to be able to do is sit down and determine, break apart why the success worked, and figure out all the different elements involved, because then we can recreate it. And when we are able to recreate positive change, what we get is a compound effect where the good changes start stacking on top of each other, and we end up with a huge momentum in our life that forces us into a great direction, and it was something that we did on purpose. We chose it. We didn't get lucky. We didn't win the lottery somehow and ended up with all of our problems solved, which, by the way, if you've ever listened to any of my work, you'll know winning the lottery does not solve your problems. But what it can do is it can give you more tools. But if you don't know how to use those tools, it doesn't do any good. So money just being a tool is a perfect example of everyone always just wants to find a creation format to generate money. But that doesn't solve your problems. Money just gives you tools to help solve different problems. But we have to identify that in order to create positive change, there has to be a deliberate and a very methodical thought process that goes into our decision-making process about how we deal with certain changes when they occur. And even more so, if there's a specific change we want to generate, then what are the small changes we have to make now to create that big one in the future and have it done on purpose? So since change is the focus of our topic today, I want to hone in on what I call the 3 I's of change. There are 3 different elements that occur in order to create a massive effect, not just to ourselves, but to anyone around us. And those are influence, impact, and inspiration. And when we come back, we're going to be diving into those in just a second. So stick around. Please don't forget to follow and review the show today. Also, head over and register at the chrisfwalker.com website. There you'll find links to the Indiegogo and Patreon campaigns, which help keep this show going. You'll also find links to the bookstore, gear shop, blog, and you'll stay up to date on upcoming events and live appearances. Now, let's get back to today's message. Welcome back. Thanks again for joining me today. Listen, influence, impact, and inspiration. We're talking right now about the 3 I's of change. Because as we just discussed, change is inevitable. So what we need to be able to do is identify the different characteristics of how change occurs in our life so that we can start making the most of those different elements and guiding them to be the cause and effect that will change things the way we want them to go. So I want to start first with talking about influence. See, influence is when someone has the ability to spit out a truth that is so steadfast and profound that regardless of who they are, it has all of the impact that is needed to create change in other people's lives. And we'll get into the impact level in just a second. But as far as influence goes, think of it as a level of authority of trust. So here's an example. As we're growing up, we often know that our parents have a lot of influence over us. We're just bred from young infants to just watch and learn from our parents. So they have a huge influence over what we learn. They have a huge influence over how we kind of learn to act, how do we become the people that we're going to become. There's a lot of influence that comes from our parents. And you know what? It doesn't always have to be a do it this way because my mom did or my dad did. It might be because mom and dad did it, I don't like it, and so I refuse to do it. But it's still a level of influence because it's coming from an authoritative figure that we actually look at and say we have a level of respect of authority for that position. Now, that level of authority, as far as what you allow it to do in your life, is something that we have to remember. We ultimately have overall authority over every decision we make. So they don't have authority over our decision making. What they do have authority over is whether or not we'll listen to what they're saying. Because often we'll just ignore most things said by most people. There's no reason to listen to it because we don't have any trust for it. And there's a level of skepticism that's pretty much healthy, but we don't want to hear most people's thoughts on things because we just don't know if it's even something that we can account for in our own lives as something that we can trust. So we have to give a level of authority over to certain levels of influence. Now, one of the weird things about society today especially is that we automatically give over a large amount of influence to people who honestly don't always have the right kind of information. A perfect example would be celebrities. You're sitting here listening to my podcast. There's no reason that you should trust me. It's just a matter of whether or not you give the level of authority to hear the words that I say and trust that they're coming from a place that you can trust. It's a leap of faith. Influence in itself is actually a measure of faith. And you see, the best part about influence is that when it's used correctly, it can not just have an impact on yourself or the people around you. It can literally span generations. Here's a perfect example. Benjamin Franklin has been dead for quite some time, but we still have countless phrases that are used from his level of wisdom that he would simply try and impart to everyone else through either his writings or his speeches. And as he did so, people, because they trusted his ability to create good change in his own life, were willing to take that leap of faith and trust that what he's saying is accurate and profound enough that they could use it for themselves. For example, early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. What he's really saying is, make sure that you get enough rest, that you're not tired throughout the day, and get up early enough to get your day started on a good foot, that you've already got your priorities straight, that your time management is a good, healthy level of influence in your life. So that's a great bit of wisdom. Now, Benjamin Franklin isn't even here anymore. He's long gone. He's dead. But his influence has carried on, because there's a level of authority behind the truth of his message. So influence is something that is a leap of faith, and that's the first thing that we need to safeguard. Who are we willing to listen to and allow them to speak into our lives for positive results? And as much as I hate to say it, there are times where we might know that our loved ones, our family members, our mom, our dad, our aunts, our uncles, our distant second cousin twice removed, doesn't matter who they are in terms of relation to us. What matters is, do we trust that what's coming out of their mouth is not going to be something that's just going to be, oh, well, we care about you and we want this to work. Instead, it's going to be something, we care about you and this is how it will work. Do it this way. And usually, those people who have that kind of hard line in the sand saying, we know this works, do it this way, often come across in manners that we don't like, because it doesn't seem like they're telling us what we want to hear. But it's not about what we want to hear. It's about the truth of what cause and effect generates. And if they've figured out that level of intelligence, that level of impact, then we need to be willing to give the authority to them so that we'll listen to them. And again, we should always have a little bit of skepticism to it to ask the question, why would they feel this way about their statements? For example, if you ever wanted to know how to make $1 million, ask a poor person. They'll tell you. But that doesn't mean they know what they're really doing. They haven't been able to generate it. Okay, so just make sure that when you're asking this of someone, that they have a level of authority that they can speak about it, and that it will be something that you can then turn around and regenerate in your own life to create the effect you want. Okay, so that brings us to impact. Now, impact is if you think about just the word itself, when we think about when a car impacts something, there's a force involved. We think about someone who's a boxer and the impact of his hit. There's a force involved. And if you really want to understand how change occurs when it comes to the 3 I's, think of impact as the force. It's the direct action that's required in order to make change happen. And oftentimes this comes from having a personal relationship with someone who has actually lived through whatever the circumstance is that you're facing and achieved the result you desire. They can actually not just tell you, hey, here's the information, because the information is the influence. Are you willing to listen to them? The impact now is, can you take that information, as hard as it may seem, and can you have the courage to do it even if it's not easy? In fact, especially if it's not easy. Because when things are hard is when they create value. If things are easy and we get it, it just kind of comes to us and we say, hey, that's nice, but we don't give it any value. But when we have to work at something, the value of it increases dramatically. It is so profound to see how important it is that impact, the actual direct hitting force, the change occurring actions that we take place in our life. Those are the things that we need to focus in on. And when it comes time to making the decision, we have to commit, because it's very easy to get sidetracked. We have to commit to saying, I'm going to make this the change in my life. And it's not easy. A perfect example of an impact is if you've ever had to deal with an addiction. Addictions are so catastrophic to every level of our lives, but what they need in order to be removed is they need a direct impact. There needs to be a drastic change, a decision-making process that is altered to our normal decision-making process, and one that we commit to, saying, I don't care what I used to do, from now on it will be this way, and yes, it will be hard. Because habits are not easy to break. They're easy to make. All you got to do is do the same thing over and over again. You do it enough times, it becomes a habit. But to change it, you've got to take what you do reflexively and turn it into something you do counter-reflexively, but deliberately. And that's not easy. But impact is the changing force that actually creates the effects we want to see in our natural world around us. Because ultimately, if we just live inside of the intangible world within our heads, all we're doing is just having a lot of good thoughts. But if you want to create physical change, and yes, even something as simple as your finances or your job or your relationships, those are physical change that have to happen outside of your own mind. It's within your mind that you can create the idea of, I'm going to allow influence to people to pour in, and in my mind, I'll mule it over. But the impact is when I decide this is the action I'm going to take, and I will commit to it regardless of the circumstances or the obstacles in the way. And impact is ultimately where change really starts occurring because of our own directives instead of someone else's. Because up until then, all we're doing is reacting from other people's impact. It's when we start creating our own impact in our life that change really starts taking on an occurrence. And that leads us to the final I, inspiration. You see, influence and impact are the two elements that help us to create the true inspiration. Because I might hear something and think it's a good idea. I might even commit to saying, I think I'll do this a little while. But until there's an actual end result that we desire, a goal, a hope in the future for what that change is going to look like, then we're not inspired to do it yet. And truly, if you want to see someone change without inspiration, it will fail. They have to have the desire, the heartfelt inspiration to succeed at whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. And it means that they need to be inspired to do so. And inspiration can take on a lot of different forms. Sometimes it's envy. Sometimes it's actually out of pain. We're desiring not to feel this kind of pain anymore. Sometimes inspiration can actually be us trying to create a change that's going to help other people. And those are the best kinds of changes, provided that they're done in the right way. Because there's a lot of good deeds that people have tried to accomplish and has actually caused a lot of harm, mostly because they have failed to remember that the same three I's we're talking about, influence, impact, and inspiration, are not just true for me, but they're true for everyone. And so if I'm inspired to create some sort of a change, but it also relies on these other people, then these other people have to be inspired to have the same change. If they're not, I'm going to be hindered because they don't care. And if I'm relying on them for one step or another within the process, I'm in a real problem because they're not wanting that change. You have to get them to want it, which means in the concept of developing your strategies for what you want change to be, you should always remember that it's not just about what you want. It's about not just getting what you really desire in your life, but how is it going to fit into the lives of other people to benefit them? If you can find a way to create a good change in your life that will help other people, and then all you got to do is let them see what that good change will be, they'll be inspired to help. And those kinds of changes create a large-scale movement that can actually change society. So with change itself, I want to focus in today on those three I's: influence, impact, and inspiration. Because when we really try to make the changes in our lives as we go through any kind of process, regardless of what our perspectives are, regardless of what we try to do for our practical application, without those three I's being present every step of the way, who is it that you're trusting to speak into your life? What's the influence that's actually being spoken into for you to create your decision-making process? And the impact that's needed in order to make the actual changes and have the courage to commit, knowing it's not going to be easy, knowing that it's not going to be a walk in the park, and then be inspired to see it through to the very end because you know what the end result will bring you. You have all of the tools necessary to truly create change, and more importantly, it's change that you're directing, you're choosing, and you have the ability to define it for yourself. Again, I want to point you back to the 3 I's of Change series that's actually on my blog at my website at chrisfwalker.com. Go on there and check out those posts. We'll go into each section in a little more detail in all those blogs, but at the very end, there's a very, very specific blog post that I really want you guys to be inspired by. And you see what that post is it explains that of all the people who have ever lived, who had influence, used impact, and had an inspiration, could even inspire others for change, there's no better teacher than Jesus Christ himself. Who else could have shown up on this world, talked to 12 people, and then changed society forever? That is the power of change. Change can be a great thing, provided that we're driving the car. But when we're just along for the ride, it becomes very difficult. And you see, when it comes to a Christian lifestyle, one of the best things there is that now you get to be in the car, but you don't have to drive so much anymore because you already know who's at the helm. And all you have to do is enjoy the ride. In fact, you can point out along the way, that's cool, look at this, neat thing, oh my goodness, oh hey, that's a little dangerous over there, what should we do? And he'll tell you. It's so much easier to have a life of good, positive change once you have learned to just accept and find the kind of truth that comes from being a Christian who follows the teachings of Christ in the Bible. So I want to make sure I point that part out, because as much as I broke into the 3 I's of change, which they're all present, and they're all going to be, you'll be able to spot them. Look through history. You can see these elements at work. Any kind of a major change that happened, you can see who it was that was the influencers. You can see the kind of impacts they made, and you can see the inspiration that was driving their decisions. But what you have to do is in your own life, determine for yourself, if you've been driving your way this whole time, and it hasn't worked out. Maybe you're not doing it right. Maybe there's a better way, and that better way is something that you can trust, that comes from truth. Jesus says, I am the truth, the way, and the light. You can have an inspiration to create the kind of life that was designed for you by the person who created you in the first place. And that leads to true joy and everlasting happiness. I realize your time is the most precious commodity you could possibly share with anyone. So I want to thank you again for spending some of yours here with me today. Don't forget to review the message for others. And be sure to follow the Chris F. Walker podcast for new releases. Remember, your generous support on sites like Indiegogo and Patreon are making this show possible. Don't forget to register at the chrisfwalker.com website for links to the bookstore, gear shop, and to stay updated for new events and appearances. I hope to see you again soon. God bless.